Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The base was under attack, and everything that Jack Marlowe knew was crumbling around him. The screams of men, the shriek of metal as it was torn apart by the savage alien creatures, and the incessant alarm blaring through the underground facility fused into a cacophony of chaos that threatened to overwhelm him. But Jack, a seasoned mechanic with grease-stained hands and a mind wired for understanding machines, had no time to process the horror unfolding around him. He had never intended to be a soldier. His world was one of tools, blueprints, and the hum of machinery, tucked safely away in the depths of the earth where the war seemed like a distant nightmare. But now, the nightmare had come to him. The Zorgoth had breached the perimeter, and the base was in shambles. The alien creatures, twice as tall as a man, with razor-sharp claws and armored hides, were a relentless force that had pushed humanity to the brink. Jack was huddled in the corner of the workshop, hands trembling as he tried to focus on the task before him. The Aegis armor, the only thing standing between humanity and total annihilation, was lying open on the floor, its intricate circuitry exposed like the guts of a living creature. Jack knew these machines better than anyone. He had spent years maintaining them, fine-tuning them for the soldiers who wore them into battle. But he had never been inside one, never felt the weight of it, never experienced the terrifying fusion of man and machine. The door to the workshop burst open, and Jack looked up to see Commander Riley, his face smeared with blood and grime, his eyes wide with desperation. "Marlowe, we need you out there," Riley barked, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "We've lost too many men. The line's breaking." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. "I'm a mechanic, not a soldier," he stammered, wiping his hands on his already filthy coveralls. Riley grabbed Jack by the collar, pulling him to his feet. "You know these suits better than anyone. If anyone can make a difference out there, it's you." Jack shook his head, panic rising in his throat. "I can't, there's no one else left," Riley roared, shoving him toward the armor. "Get in the damn suit, Marlowe." The weight of the commander's words crashed over Jack like a wave. He stared at the armor, its metallic sheen reflecting the flickering lights of the workshop. The world outside was crumbling, and here he was, standing on the precipice of a choice he had never wanted to make. With trembling hands, Jack approached the Aegis armor. The suit loomed over him, its cold, lifeless eyes staring back at him as if daring him to step inside. He hesitated for a moment longer, then reached out and touched the smooth metal surface. It was cool to the touch, almost soothing in a way, like the machines he had worked on all his life. But this was different. This was war. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to Riley. "All right, let's do this." The armor opened with a hiss, revealing the complex web of wires and circuitry within. Jack stepped inside, the cold metal pressing against his body as the suit began to close around him. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced, an overwhelming rush of data flooding his brain as the suit's neural interface connected with his mind. His vision blurred, then sharpened as the suit's HUD flickered to life, displaying a wealth of information he had only ever seen on screens. The armor was heavy, but not unbearably so. It moved with him, responding to his slightest movements with precision and speed. Jack flexed his fingers, watching as the suit's gauntlet hands mimicked his actions perfectly. It was strange, feeling the machine as an extension of his own body, yet separate from it. Riley slapped him on the back, a rare smile breaking through the grime on his face. "You look like a natural," he said, though the words were tinged with desperation. Jack didn't feel like a natural. He felt like a man about to walk into hell. But there was no turning back now. He had to try, if not for himself, then for the people who were dying out there. "Let's go," Jack said, his voice sounding strange in his ears, distorted by the suit's internal comms. Riley led the way out of the workshop, and Jack followed, the armor's servos whirring softly as he moved. The base was a war zone. The corridors were littered with debris, broken equipment, shattered glass, and the bodies of soldiers who had fallen in the initial assault. The walls were scorched and blackened from energy blasts, and the air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal. As they approached the outer defenses, the sounds of battle grew louder, the roar of gunfire, the guttural growls of the Zorgoth, the screams of the wounded and dying. Jack's heart raced, every instinct telling him to turn back, to run and hide. But he forced himself to keep moving, each step bringing him closer to the chaos outside. They reached the breach in the outer wall, where the alien forces were pouring through like a flood. The soldiers who remained were fighting with a desperation born of hopelessness, their weapons barely making a dent in the alien horde. The Aegis armor units were doing their best to hold the line, but they were outnumbered, and the Zorgoth were relentless. Riley pointed to a group of soldiers pinned down by a particularly large group of Zorgoth. "Over there," he said. "They need backup." Jack nodded, his mouth dry as sandpaper. He raised the armor's gauntlet, feeling the familiar weight of the plasma cannon integrated into the suit's arm. It was a weapon he had worked on countless times, but never fired. Now, it was his only lifeline. He aimed at the nearest Zorgoth, a towering brute with armor-like scales and glowing red eyes. His finger tightened on the trigger, and the cannon fired with a deafening roar. The plasma bolt struck the creature square in the chest, burning through its thick hide and sending it crashing to the ground with a pained roar. The other soldiers cheered, their spirits momentarily lifted by the sight of the creature falling. But Jack barely heard them. He was focused on the battle, on the countless other Zorgoth that were closing in. He fired again, and again, each shot a desperate attempt to stem the tide. For a few minutes, it seemed to work. The Zorgoth hesitated, their advance slowing as they took note of the new threat. But then, with a deafening roar, they surged forward once more, a tidal wave of claws and teeth that threatened to overwhelm the human defenders. Jack fought with everything he had, every shot fired with deadly precision. But it wasn't enough. The Zorgoth were too many, too powerful. The human soldiers were being pushed back, inch by inch, their resolve crumbling under the relentless assault. And then, just when it seemed all hope was lost, Jack saw it, a pattern in the chaos. The Zorgoth weren't just mindless beasts, they were moving with a purpose, following some kind of strategy. He watched as they attacked in coordinated waves, their movements synchronized in a way that seemed almost mechanical. It was then that Jack realized the truth. The Zorgoth were being controlled, guided by some kind of central intelligence. And if he could find that intelligence, if he could disrupt their command structure, he might be able to turn the tide of the battle. "Commander!" Jack shouted into the comms, his voice cutting through the noise of battle. "The Zorgoth, they're being controlled. There's a command signal. If we can jam it, we can break their coordination." Riley's voice crackled in his ear, tinged with disbelief. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Jack replied, his mind racing as he pieced together the clues. "I've seen this kind of thing before, in the way machines interact with each other. They're acting like a network. Take out the hub, and the rest will fall apart." There was a pause on the other end, then Riley's voice came back, filled with a renewed sense of urgency. "All right, Marlowe. You're the expert. What do you need?" Jack scanned the battlefield, his HUD displaying a chaotic mess of information. He focused on the source of the signal, filtering out the noise until he found it, a faint, but unmistakable pulse of energy emanating from the heart of the Zorgoth forces. "There," he shouted, marking the location on the map. "That's where the signal's coming from. We need to get there and shut it down." Riley didn't hesitate. "All units, follow Marlowe's lead. We're taking out that signal." The soldiers rallied around Jack, their fear replaced by a grim determination. They had a goal now, a purpose beyond mere survival. Jack led the charge, the Aegis armor's servos straining as he pushed forward, cutting a path through the alien horde. The closer they got to the signal, the stronger the resistance became. The Zorgoth seemed to sense the threat, throwing everything they had at the human forces in a desperate attempt to protect their command center. But Jack was relentless, his mind focused on the task at hand, every shot fired with precision and purpose. Finally, they reached the source of the signal, a massive Zorgoth creature, larger than any of the others, its body bristling with strange, glowing appendages. It stood at the center of a clearing, surrounded by a group of smaller Zorgoth, all of them seemingly connected to the larger creature by a web of energy. "This is it," Jack muttered to himself, his heart pounding in his chest. "This is the hub." He raised his plasma cannon, aiming for the creature's head. But before he could fire, the creature let out a deafening roar, the energy around it crackling with intensity. The ground shook as the creature unleashed a wave of energy, knocking the soldiers off their feet and sending Jack crashing to the ground. For a moment, everything went black. Jack's ears rang, his body aching from the impact. But he forced himself to get up, the armor's systems struggling to reboot. He couldn't afford to stay down, not now, not when they were so close. That he pushed himself to his feet, his vision swimming as he tried to focus on the creature. It was still standing, its glowing eyes locked onto him with a malevolent intelligence. The smaller Zorgoth were closing in, ready to finish him off, but Jack wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when the fate of the world was on the line. With a roar of defiance, he charged at the creature, the plasma cannon firing with reckless abandon. The bolts of energy struck the creature, burning through its armored hide and causing it to stumble. The smaller Zorgoth tried to intervene, but Jack fought them off, his mind and body working in perfect harmony with the suit. He reached the creature, his hands gripping the cannon as he pressed it against the creature's head. With a final, desperate effort, he pulled the trigger, unleashing a torrent of energy that blasted through the creature's skull, tearing it apart from the inside. The creature let out a final, pained roar, then collapsed to the ground, its body disintegrating into ash as the energy dissipated. The smaller Zorgoth froze, their connection to the hub severed. For a moment, they stood motionless, as if unsure of what to do. Then, one by one, they began to fall, their bodies crumbling as the network that had sustained them disintegrated. The battle was over. The human forces had won. Jack stood there, panting heavily, his body trembling with exhaustion. He looked around at the battlefield, at the bodies of the fallen soldiers, at the smoldering remains of the Zorgoth. The base was in ruins, but it was still standing. Earth was still standing. Riley's voice crackled in his ear. "Marlowe, you did it. You saved us." Jack didn't respond, too exhausted to speak. He simply nodded, his mind still reeling from the battle. He had never wanted to be a hero, never wanted to be on the front lines. But in that moment, he had been exactly what humanity needed. As the adrenaline began to fade, Jack felt the weight of the armor pressing down on him, the exhaustion creeping into his bones. He wanted nothing more than to collapse, to sleep for days, but there was still work to be done. He made his way back to the base, his movements slow and deliberate. The other soldiers parted for him, their faces a mix of awe and gratitude. Jack barely noticed them, his mind focused on the workshop, on the machines that awaited him there, when he finally reached the workshop, he stepped out of the armor, the cold air biting at his skin as the suit disengaged. He felt a strange sense of loss as the armor was removed, as if a part of him had been left behind, but there was no time to dwell on it. The armor needed repairs, the base needed rebuilding, and there were still Zorgoth out there. Somewhere in the darkness, Jack picked up his tools, his hands steady despite the fatigue. He had a job to do, and he would see it through to the end. Because that's who he was, a mechanic, a man who fixed things. The world had been broken, but he had helped to fix it. And as long as there was work to be done, as long as there were machines that needed tending, he would be there, doing what he did best. That he glanced at the armor, now resting in the corner of the workshop, and felt a strange connection to it. It had saved his life, and he had saved it. They had saved each other. With a sigh, Jack returned to his work, the sounds of the workshop familiar and comforting. The war wasn't over, but for now, there was peace. And in that peace, Jack found a small measure of contentment. As he worked, he allowed himself a moment to think about the future, about what would come next. The world was still a dangerous place, filled with threats that lurked in the shadows. But Jack knew that, whatever happened, he would be ready, because he was more than just a mechanic now. He was a soldier, a fighter, a man who had faced the darkness and come out the other side, and he was ready for whatever came next.